Can we eat our way out of the diabetes risk zone by consuming the right foods in appropriate amounts? Does it really matter whether we're fat or thin? Or more precisely, being overweight and having a body mass index, which is BMI, greater than or equal to 25, or being obese and having a BMI greater than or equal to 30? Yes, it does. A recent study led by Peter Nordstrom at Umeå University in Sweden and published in August 2016 followed and compared 4,046 genetically identical twin pairs with differing levels of body fat over 12 years. Results showed evidence that our body mass index, BMI, does affect our risk of developing type 2 diabetes. The findings confirm the causal link between obesity and diabetes, which is a growing epidemic throughout the world. Therefore, weight reduction should remain the cornerstone for the prevention of diabetes, reads one of the conclusions. Another study, Diet, Lifestyle and the Risk of Type 2 Diabetes Mellitus in Women from 2001, which included close to 90,000 people, concluded that obesity and weight gain dramatically increase the risk of developing type 2 diabetes. But it is not only the total amount of calories that you intake and the BMI that counts, so does the distribution between, for example, fat, protein and carbohydrates. For many years, sugar was the bad guy and something we should avoid, but eventually fat became the bad guy. However, Professor Arne Astrup, a leading expert in nutrition and diabetes, is now saying that restricting our intake of carbohydrates might be the way to reduce or even eliminate the use of medication in diabetes treatments. Thank you for joining the discussion. In a recent study, you concluded that reducing carbohydrates may be an answer for prevention of diabetes. So if that's the case, then sugar and fat are not the bad guys anymore.
Well, carbohydrate, that's also sugars, they're also carbohydrates. So to some extent, sugar is also included that in the group of carbohydrate that needs to be reduced. But it's correct that we more and more have research that actually shows that it's the carbohydrate that is the key issue in terms of the diet for those who develop type 2 diabetes. And to reduce that in the diet seems to be quite effective.
Can you explain why carbohydrates are bad?
Well, generally, carbohydrates are probably not bad for the entire population, but for those who are susceptible to develop type 2 diabetes, they seem to be bad. And I think one have to consider that before you develop type 2 diabetes, you actually have what we call pre-diabetes. And that's a condition that is characterized by insulin resistance. And insulin resistance means that the insulin you're producing in your body to get the glucose into the cells is not working properly. So it means that blood sugar started to rise because the sugar can't get into the cells. And that's a kind of a condition we see. And when in some way the problem is that the sugar is accumulating in your blood and cannot get into the cells due to this lack of action of insulin, it's quite obvious that you should try to reduce the intake of glucose and what is converted into glucose, namely carbohydrates. So in some way it makes a lot of sense. It's quite logic in some way.
With carbohydrates, is this very new information? Because I haven't heard about this before, that you maybe need to reduce our carbohydrates.
I think the recommendations for type 2 diabetics, those who already have the disease, have been going up and down over the last 500 years since, it was recognized as being a disease. So sometimes it's been, cut down on fat, sometimes cut down on carbs, and sometimes you should even only have spirits and wine and beer. So it's been all kinds of recommendations. So there is actually some confusion about it, but I think more and more after we have got some more robust research with randomized trials, we can see that the restriction of carbohydrates is much more effective both to prevent diabetes but also to avoid the weight gain that typically leads to type 2 diabetes.
I always thought it was the number of calories that counted with a healthy diet. Is that the case still?
Well, of course, it's you cannot gain weight and become overweight and obese unless you consume more calories and you expend by your metabolic rate and your physical activity. But we have been telling people for nearly 60 years now that if you want to avoid gaining weight and do something about their overweight and obesity, they should simply cut down on calories. And it has been extremely ineffective because we actually seen the opposite, that they eat more. And the reason for that is that nobody can really, restrict or impose on yourself that you should consume fewer calories, because what is that determines when you stop eating? That's actually when you feel satiation and fullness, and that is depending on what type of foods you eat. And for very insulin sensitive people who are lean and physically active, if they want to lose weight, they should probably cut down on the fat in the diet, as we used to say. But for those who are more insulin resistant, those who are more prone or susceptible to develop type 2 diabetes, they should cut down on carbohydrates. And if they cut down on carbohydrates, they actually automatically consume fewer calories, because a diet with fewer carbohydrates and more fat and protein will make them feel more satiated and fuller after they have consumed just a smaller amount of the meal. So you could say that, of course, calories counts, but it's not the message to those who want to lose weight or to prevent that they are developing type 2 diabetes. It's actually, the reduction in caloric intake will come automatically if you change the diet to fewer carbohydrates, if you are among those who are susceptible to develop type 2 diabetes.
Even though it appears that we can fight diabetes by restricting our intake of carbohydrates and other nutrients, the relationship between BMI and diabetes vary in different populations. For example, people with diabetes in Southeast Asia generally have a lower BMI than populations in Europe. This tells us that the risk of developing diabetes also depends on things other than a high BMI. And it also tells us that we can't directly apply information from high-income countries to low and middle-income countries. But why do we see these differences? Let's ask Professor Venkat Narayan. Now, I'm very interested to know if you could explain the difference that you've observed in relation to BMI in diabetes in high-income countries and low-income countries.
The type 2 diabetes epidemic is striking very hard in all parts of low and middle income countries, including Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. While people in these populations are becoming obese, and a significant part of the increase in diabetes prevalence is probably due to the classical risk factors such as obesity, physical inactivity, high calorie intake, very similar to what is happening in high-income countries. We are also seeing type 2 diabetes growing in people who are thin, in other words, normal weight or even underweight in low and middle-income countries. For example, in a recent report published in The Lancet, 38% of type 2 diabetes in a clinic in Kenya was in people who were normal or underweight. And in Chennai, India, we have unpublished data suggesting that even in people with a BMI of less than 18.5, over 20% have type 2 diabetes. We need far more research to understand why thin people are developing type 2 diabetes in developing countries. One possibility is that they also have poor insulin secretion to start with, and do not have the compensatory ability to deal with the metabolic load from a small amount of weight gain or from loss of physical activity or a small increase in consumption of refined carbohydrates.
If you have a low BMI or an average one, how important is the quality of food and nutrition?
I think the quality of nutrition and physical activity is important for everybody. I think that's a universal recommendation we should be promoting regardless of where people are living. But in the context of low and middle income country, that idea of improving the quality of nutrition and improving physical activity might also apply to women who are pregnant, which is also the case in high income countries. But what might be different, which we haven't uncovered yet, is that because of this double disadvantage of poor insulin secretion to start with, plus the addition of high insulin resistance because of gain in weight, might be a particular problem in low and middle income countries.
Would you then recommend that the diet be different for low and middle income countries compared to maybe the higher income countries?
No, I think the quality of diet is probably going to be very similar in terms of what we recommend. But I think what we might need to pay attention to is there might be a significant part of diabetes in low and middle income countries occurring in the low BMI group, for which the diagnostic test might be different, the preventive strategies might be different, the initial treatments might be different. Like, for example, just promoting lifestyle changes and promoting use of metformin as a first strategy may not be enough in this population. They might require something that also helps them to improve insulin secretion or preserve insulin secretion.
Why are people with a low BMI then getting diabetes?
High quality of nutrition is one key factor for preventing diabetes. Unfortunately, in Southeast Asia and in Sub-Saharan Africa, nutrition quality is generally inadequate, and refined carbohydrates are a major source of calories. For example, in southern India, over 70% of calories consumed comes from one single source, and that is refined white rice. And the food is generally very low in high quality, such as low in fruits and vegetables, low in proteins, and also high in saturated fats. So we need to improve the quality of nutrition by promoting access and consumption to high fiber carbohydrates such as rye bread, brown rice, increased protein consumption, more use of monosaturated fats such as olive oil, mustard oil, more fresh fruits and vegetables, less fried fruits, and less processed foods. Nutrition recommendations, therefore, need to be tailored to local food habits, local culture, and to local availability. And we also need to structure our recommendations to relate to the costs of nutrition on the one hand, and simultaneously lower the cost of high quality foods on the other.
Professor Venkat's as well as Professor Astrup's findings seem to echo later decades of research that support the importance of individual nutrients and foods in the prevention and treatment of type 2 diabetes. Furthermore, it is rather the quality of their content of fat and carbohydrate that is more important than the amount of these macronutrients. Nutritional recommendations from, for example, WHO and national diabetes organizations point to diets rich in whole grains, fruits, vegetables, legumes and nuts, moderate alcohol consumption, low intake of refined grains, red or processed meat and sugar-sweetened beverages. All in all, a diet that is in composition reminiscent of a traditional Mediterranean diet. To fit into a global level, such a diet should be tailored to personal, cultural and regional food preferences and differences. In some countries, such as India, the importance of food quality is underestimated in relation to the development of diabetes, and ongoing studies are trying to find out whether combating diabetes on a global scale should also include food quality as perhaps a more important indicator than your BMI level.